I'm the founder of the Minnesota Second Chance Coalition, which lobbied for criminal justice reforms and still does in Minnesota, and the Restore the Vote Coalition, which lobbies on voting rights restoration in Minnesota. And I've spent my entire professional life working in those two fields. I chose to become a lobbyist after many years of doing advocacy and spending time at the Capitol, because I am today the only woman of color, well, the only person of color contract lobbyist in the state of Minnesota. As long as I remain the only lobbyist of color, conversations at the Capitol will not change. And so I have been making a concerted effort to try to mentor and hire more people of color at the Capitol. You know, this past year I also did make the decision to speak up about sexual harassment at the state capitol in hopes that it would create a safer environment for women who want to become lobbyists, and particularly women of color, because I think I've seen many women get very discouraged in their first few weeks at the Capitol because of the environment and the rampant sexual harassment.
At the end of last fall, I met with my friend Ilhan Omar, who was at the Capitol, and with one of my really good friends, Sarah Super. And we went to her, Sarah and I went to her and said, hey, we are both survivors of sexual violence, and we want you to author this bill that would eliminate the statute of limitations for reporting cases of sexual violence. And Ilhan was like, of course, and she took it on. House Republicans shot it down. But it's something like we had never lobbied before in our lives. Like, I had been to the Capitol before and had done like some really basic stuff, but this is the first time where I had gone in and I was there every single day, like pressuring people and be like, what will make you move? And then meeting with like different associations that I knew that would help them move. And I realized that this is what they didn't want us to know, that it's so easy to connect with your legislators, especially if you are a constituent. Because, and I have a constituent who was known for making really racist remarks, who was known for being extremely homophobic. And so when I went into his office, I was like, he's not gonna listen to me, but well, let's go anyways. And I went in and I said, hey, I live in your neighborhood, and I'm a survivor of sexual violence, and this is why this is important to me. And he co-authored the bill.
Wow.
That is the impact of going and meeting with your legislators. That is like grassroots lobbying at its finest, right? So when we go and we show like, hey, you are accountable to me because people from our neighborhood put you in office, that's what gets people to move. Right?
And so at First Unitarian Society, we have a group called Active Voices. After the 2016 election, Kathleen came back to First Unitarian Society after a long hiatus and said, I've got to do something. I'm going to write a letter every week. Who wants to join me? And so this group of women get together every Tuesday afternoon now, and they decide what issue they're going to work on. And they talk about it, and they talk about the language and how do they need to pitch it. And by Sunday, they have postcards printed with the address labels already on them, and say, here, will you sign these 5 postcards for the Senate Judiciary Committee? Will you sign this to stop line 3? And they make it easy for all of us in the congregation to do advocacy. They educate us on the issues and then make it easy for us to do advocacy. And now we are working hard to increase our impact. So we would love for all of you and your organizations to join us, so that we can increase our impact and have a postcard avalanche, what we're doing. The other piece that I want to say is that before I had this current position, I was the director for the Minnesota Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And I spent a fair amount of time both at the Capitol in St. Paul and lobbying in Washington for reproductive health from a faith perspective. And what I heard legislators say over and over again is it's so important to hear from people of faith about progressive issues connected to our faith, because they so often hear from the other side. And so I'm all for the separation of church and state, absolutely. And when I go into a legislator's office and I say, for example, I'm pro-choice because of my faith, not in spite of it, that carries some weight with a pro-choice legislator who is looking to say, not one side owns the narrative around faith. And so I think that's true not just for choice, but other progressive issues.
I began my lobbying efforts at the Capitol over 6 years ago on trying to reform gun violence in our state. We did get a small piece of legislation to take guns away from domestic abusers. And the police department, actually, the police departments in our state backed that particular piece of legislation because they get harmed and killed when they go to answer calls for domestic violence where there's a gun in the home. You know, all of you who think that lobbying is a difficult proposition or daunting or something that you're not ready to take on, you can always go to one of these days on the Hill. The Land Stewardship Project has one every year on legislation around farming issues, and everyone gets to go talk to their legislators, and you get trained up before you go. You go with a group of people, so you're not doing it all alone. And then a lot of the environmental groups have had a water action day up at the Capitol the last 2 years, and we went and talked to legislators about all pieces of legislation that had to do with water issues, and it was kind of the same format where you met as a group, you got to hear about which pieces of legislation were important to talk about, to have a story, because stories are so compelling to legislators to hear how, you know, water issues have personally impacted your life. We've come up with this idea for trusted partners where people from different organizations can sign up with their organization to be ready to contact their legislator when a critical piece of legislation is being developed to influence it before it gets to committee. We've heard from, you know, Senator Patricia Torres Ray, by the time it gets to committee, it's too late. They don't bring it up to committee unless they have all the votes they need to get it out of committee. So you really have to be in there earlier because they want to hear from you. Only a handful of people can make a significant change in how your legislator looks on an issue.
We are working very hard to educate the public about how we currently pay for health care, how wasteful it is, and how many people are left out, and how abysmal our outcomes are in this richest country in the world, best health care system in the world. So that's kind of our main strategy, is really trying to get in front of as many people as we can, interact with as many people as we can, individuals, groups, partner effectively with other organizations like Minnesota Nurses Association, Physicians for a National Health Program, Isaiah, the big group called Our Minnesota Future, Land Stewardship Project, other organizations who have healthcare at the, you know, at the maybe top 1, 2, or 3 on their list of issues. We all know that this is top. It's really the top 1, 2, or 3 issues for voters this year. But the trick is to get people to vote as though this issue matters. And instead of voting stuff that doesn't really matter, and of course Greater Minnesota tends to send people to the legislature who aren't really gonna, they're the people who have the greatest need as a block, and they send people to the legislature who literally are not gonna go to work for them on this issue. So we're trying hard to get to Greater Minnesota as much as we can and try to educate people about what's wrong with how we pay for healthcare. A vision for how we could do this differently, and yes, it involves government. So we try to do a little PR for government along the way, to say the government has a role in fixing this problem. Because we can't, nothing happens until a bill can get heard in a committee. And nothing can get heard unless the leadership in the legislature decides that your bill is going to get heard. So it kind of involves teaching people about the process a little bit too. The majority has to care about your issue. The leadership has to agree that it's going to get heard. The committees have to agree that those committees will hear your measure on both sides, right? So you have to have a legislature friendly to health and human services, or climate change, or criminal justice reform, or gun violence prevention, all of our issues. And boy, it's a hard this is hard to educate people, that you have to look at the priorities of people running for office, get past the, the code language, and get into what are you really gonna support, and get them to care about what you care about, and give people a sense that they have power if they will get involved. And I find that getting involved in campaigns makes a huge difference. If you door knock with a candidate, they will remember you. If you have expertise in an area and you offer expertise as an honest broker for your issue, you can have some influence if you offer some information that helps them understand. Because not every office holder is on every committee, and they don't have expertise in every single area that each of us cares about. But eventually they're going to have to vote on it, right? So it's many things. Getting the right majority, having the leadership with you, having the committee structure with you.
Add that in all of this, we do have what's called the Minnesota Health Plan. So there is a health plan in Minnesota that is ready to go. If we could all be on board. You might think you're just one voice, but if you use and exercise that voice, it really is more powerful than you think.
If our congregation, which is not huge, can send out 200 postcards each week, imagine what congregations in greater Minnesota and in some other areas could do, and really we're trying to increase that impact. So we're planning a webinar in January.
I'm looking at comprehensive probation reform. Minnesota has the highest rate of probation in the nation and the longest probation sentences. So we have a bill, we will be putting forward a bill that will cap probation lengths at 5 years. We'll also be introducing again the felony voting rights restoration bill, and another bill in criminal justice for veteran sentencing. So that will allow veterans to get special consideration given that they've served our country, and so that they won't have criminal convictions on their record. I also represent Everytown for Gun Safety, and we will be pushing criminal background checks on all gun purchases and gun violence restraining orders. And then probably related to this group, I also represent the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, and particularly the Young Women's Initiative. I'm going to be your lobbyist. So I'm going to be helping actually to train some of the young women to actually become lobbyists, and we are going to hopefully figure out what we're going to do, but of the issues they want to create greater economic opportunities for young women of color, and also look at issues of sexual violence and harassment.
Wonderful.
We're a nonpartisan group, so we reach out to all types of folks with different views to try to get them to come together and work on making sure that we address climate change in whatever way we can. There's wonderful solutions to our climate issues. But if our legislature is not pushing policy to get us there fast enough, we're going to be in a world of hurt. I mean, all the other issues that we all face are going to be so much harder to work on. So we're going to reassess depending on what happens in November.
I am also serve on the board for Break the Iowa in State, Minnesota. And so we are going to push once again for the elimination of the statute that limits people from reporting when they can. None of my attackers can be reported now because now that I feel ready to do so, I cannot. And that should change, obviously. So we're going to work on it again. And if if you or anyone you know want to get involved in that initiative, we are working on that, and then also a little bit on violence against women.
Fantastic.